Hello everybody and welcome to the long-awaited conclusion to our ranking of the areas in the Souls series. Over 3,000 of you cast your votes for the best and worst areas in Dark Souls 3, and today we'll finally see the first half of where they shake out. When thinking on what makes a good area, I would consider things like level design, overall aesthetic, if the difficulty is balanced, the lore, enemies scattered throughout, and admittedly, it's going to be hard to ignore what bosses lie in wait. And also admittedly, I've thrown shade at the Dark Souls 3 areas in the past for being a bit bland overall in terms of visual design, and as always, I'm so boss obsessed that I can sometimes forget other aspects that make up the Souls experience. But today I'll be stepping back and giving these areas a fresh look based on the criteria I mentioned. Plus, with this being a community voted ranking, I'll get to feature your comments throughout as a way of creating a discussion between us all. Without further ado, here's the first half of the Dark Souls 3 areas ranked from worst to best.
Are you kidding me?
If you had asked me off the top of my head which area would be bringing up the butt of our list, Road to Sacrifices wouldn't have even been in the conversation. Not because it's worthy of high praise, but because it's so goddamn forgettable that I'd never remember to shit on it. Apparently I'm the only one who forgot. Case in point being this comment from Andreas. Am I the only one who hated Road of Sacrifices? It's just a boring area that was not needed. Honestly, they could have slipper it and gone to FARRON Keep and Cathedral of the Deep instantly. This was the top voted comment on my post, so clearly the memory of Road of Sacrifices lackluster suckage is a vivid memory for most of you. Now, I don't know about slippering anything, but if you would suggest the road being sacrificed to make way for the direct path to FARRON Keep and Cathedral of the Deep, that's not a bad thought. Slyfrog27 says, worst area, Road of Sacrifices. Why? It's a short, needless area to join Undead Settlement with Farron Swamp. Introduces enemies you basically won't ever see again and honestly has no point being there. So we're in agreement. The area is a connecting block between 3 other areas and doesn't shine individually. But that's not enough to garner hatred to bring it to the worst area in the entire game. No, we gotta dig deeper. Fucking crabs. Deeper? Why is this a unique zone? No bosses, no secrets. It's a pointless, gangful, grade A suck-it zone. So it and its only bonfire can suck it. Deeper? I Dublin hate this place. I don't even care. The enemies are annoying as hell, the whole level is linear except for that bitchy crab swamp, and the lead up to FARRON Keep and Cathedral are both pretty boring. 3 out of 10 cause the birdmen kept shutting on me. Alright, time to school this shut stain of an area. Yes, it's a crappy connector for 3 other areas. That's its main purpose. I can't fault it for that. A lot of the areas in the game connect to other areas. What I can fault it for is having no lore significance other than Aldrich took a dump here on the way to the cathedral, being as visually forgettable as the gameplay experience, and having some of the worst enemies in the game. Dark Souls 3 teleporting dogs, an army of swamp people wanting to shank you with trees, overgrown crabs with a penchant for one-shotting low-level players, you know, the level you're likely to be when you come to the 3rd level in the game, then lycanthropes that are better left alone unless you want to get ravaged. It's seriously awful. None of the enemies are fun to fight, maybe with the exception of that Black Knight who's chilling in the back because why not? There's nothing special here other than the frustrating enemies, and if that's the only memorable takeaway, I think Road to Sacrifices found itself in the exact spot that it deserves. My memory continues to fail me. I say this mostly because these days all I think about when it comes to FARRON Keep is dagger walking through the muck as quickly as possible to the awesome boss at the end. But then I realize my own way of getting through FARRON Keep brings out 2 flaws. First, I overlook the area because I'm so hellbent on getting through it quickly. Second, I have to make sure I have a specific weapon ability to get through this area due to its inherent design. God, the slow walking in FARRON drove me nuts. Oh, you sweet summer child, let me introduce you to a place called the Valley of Defuckment. No, you know what, we're not doing that. We're not invalidating experiences based on one shitty area having something in common with another. Being poisoned is bad, an area being 80% poison swamp is worse. Making you walk slower inside of it to ensure you get poisoned is asshole design. Frankly, it's irritating at this point that FromSoft hasn't moved beyond it. It's not fun, and it feels like arbitrary difficulty to add a mechanic to an area that ensures your health is constantly draining if you don't have purple moss out the wazoo. As David King says, fat rolling through a seemingly endless shit swamp is not why I play the Souls games. Well said, but I do get the thought behind the design. Make an area that is effectively the floor is lava and require the player to explore it thoroughly by requiring them to put out 3 fires to continue. I can respect the thought. Really, I like the idea of requiring exploration throughout an area to continue because many Souls areas like the Road of Sacrifices are thoughtless pathways to sprint through. But while I could probably give the poison a pass out of some sort of distorted version of Souls Stockholm Syndrome, the slow mechanic while allowing enemies to move at normal speed is complete dog shit. And I say this as someone who runs through the area only enough to get the Estus shards, undead bone shards, fires, and then gets out. For anyone that wants to fully explore and get the other items, I wish sweet mercy upon you. Before we move on though, there's one other thing I want to mention. Grus. These are without a doubt, in my mind, some of the worst enemies in the Souls series. I would rather fist fight a Winter Lantern in an ocean of bone wheel skeletons than deal with these vermin. They are absurdly fast, have melee ranges that enemies with 10-foot spears would envy, and are rarely found without at least 2 to 3 in the same place to gank you. Adding in their speed and pursuit with a swamp that prevents your escape is the final nail in the coffin that is this toxic keep. Before moving on, I wanted to take a brief moment and give a huge thanks to Project Orochi for sponsoring this video. In seriousness, this Japanese-inspired streetwear company has some fantastic designs. I'm a huge fan of Japanese artwork, and I think they showcase it marvelously. If I had to rank my top 3 best designs they have right now, number 3, the Tora hoodie with the red sun and tiger. Number 2, the Viper's Retreat long sleeve tee based on the character Nobushi from For Honor. And number 1, the Shinobi tee. Because until Sekiro finally releases, you have the option to cuddle this shirt in the fetal position. Their marketing team was nice enough to hook us up with a 10% code off in my name. If you like their brand as much as I do, check out the shop linked in the description. It's a great way to support the channel and get some dope clothes in the process. Thanks for listening, let's jump back into the ranking. Now here's an area I fully expected to find at the bottom of the list. It was close between the scores of the bottom handful of areas, but IRITHYLL Dungeon managed to squeak up to 3rd worst. Why? I still have traumatic PTSD memories of my max health disappearing before my eyes. You and me both all about that animation, you and all of us. Man, I fucking hate IRITHYLL Dungeon. Jailers are fucktards, they drain add so much weight to you, they drain max HP, plus this area is a goddamn maze, there are rats, basilisks, jailers, and those maggot things. And it leads to a poison area with a swamp. Nice. Lovely. Would do again, 10 out of 10. That about sums it up. While the actual level structure of IRITHYLL Dungeon is well done with the exception of one room that might be the biggest middle finger in any of the 5 games, the enemies lurking within are generally garbage. Focusing directly on the jailers, I again understand the thought here. Most enemies in the Souls series are square up and fight, but they have a mechanic to combat that. So instead, you duck and dive to stay alive and manage your Estus as you go throughout. The problem is that they slow you down, they chase too quickly, they have long weapons to brand you dead, and it's just plain frustrating to lose HP to mere line of sight. But I did see a bit of defense for the dungeon. The dungeon's labyrinthine layout and dangerous on-site enemies really set the atmosphere of a horribly oppressive dungeon where there's nothing but despair. I didn't enjoy playing through it, and that's the point I'd say. But from a gameplay perspective, once you figure out the trick to each part of it, it's not that difficult to get through. This is a perfectly reasonable line of thought. Where my opinion and likely many of yours differs is that even though the dungeon accurately provides a feeling of despair, it doesn't do it in a rewarding way due to difficult combat-focused enemies, but instead enemies that feel more like traps than anything else. And the idea that it's not difficult to get through once you know how to serves to say that once you're aware of the layout and tricks, you feel motivated to rush through because it's so terrible. Like FARRON Keep, I can respect what they were trying to do here, but that doesn't mean they executed it well. On that basis, the dungeon is down where it belongs. One of the greatest moments I had in the game was getting the fuck out of the catacombs of CARTHUS, take a breath, and finally seeing the beautiful night sky of IRITHYLL of the Boreal Valley. That doesn't make IRITHYLL of the Boreal Valley better to me, but it definitely describes how much I hated the catacombs. Well, if that doesn't sum it up, then I felt my Chalice Dungeon PTSD kicking in. Ganky skeleton fights, traps, witches, mazy and frustrating to navigate, and super tedious. At least with the Chalices, you sometimes got a good boss, not Vape God Wolnir. Right along with Grus, I feel I've never expressed my hatred for the skeletons in this series. Going all the way back to 4-1 and Demon Souls, their speed, pursuit, unpredictable attacks, bleed afflictions, and resistance to anything not blunt has always made them a pain. Add in a trove of them inside a sprawling maze with traps galore, rats, and new skeletons with ranged attacks and even more speed, and you're in for a world of annoyance. Just like all the other areas so far, this is another to dive in, get what you need, and get to the boss as quickly as possible. Even if Wolnir is as much of a disappointment as this area, at least as Gerardo eloquently put it, you'll be getting some fresh air afterward. Ignoring the fact that this area is titled as a garden, it's kinda shat to the side of Lothar Castle as a toxic afterthought. The game managed to shoehorn in another poison swamp, and if that's not enough, it's the origin of another enemy vying for the worst in the series, the Pus of Man. I have never figured out how to efficiently handle these erratic, hitbox disrespecting grotesque terrors, so of course I just run past and pretend they don't exist, because it is worth venturing around the place for the Titanite chunks. Other than that, it's just a sprint to Osiros. I think this comment encapsulates my feelings nicely. No, I literally just run through because fuck this place. In my opinion, Smoldering Lake is the worst area. Apart from the unique items, the souls, and the Estus bone shards, there's no reason to go there. Stunlock enemies that don't even touch you? Check. Toxic enemies? Check. Fucking annoying basilisks? Check. An annoying, tedious, and bland area? Check. A shitty gimmick that is more annoying than a real fun challenge, the giant crossbow? Check. Optional unless you want to max out items and get some of the better weapons in the game that are the sole reason you come here? Check. Boss that's more annoying than challenge? Check. Mini bosses that are better than the actual boss? Check. I mean, well, damn, I kinda just want to roll scene and move on to the next one. To put it shortly, this area is bad due to irritating enemies, a ballista that is one of the worst designed environmental hazards in the series, and having nothing to offer outside of a few key bonus items. Problem is, if you want those key items, you have to suffer for them. Why? Why not add those in an optional area that is actually fun instead of this shit heap of a demon ruin? As we'll see from the other optional areas later on, it's entirely possible to add a bunch of worthwhile pickups to an area with great design. Instead, we're stuck with the remnants of one of the worst areas in the franchise that tried to one-up it instead of improving on it. What a shame. Calling it now, Undead Settlement as worst area. You and I both would have been wrong, True TV. If you were to have casually asked me what my least favorite area was off the top of my head, there's a good chance that I say Undead Settlement. Even though all opinions are naturally born out of bias, mine is thrown far more toward this being an annoying area to run through quickly, making it bad for me. All the lowest areas on our list had one delightful thing in common. You can run through them very quickly if you know the way. Undead Settlement, on the other hand, can be a bit of a slog to get through. It's boring. The Covenant is okay. The Pyromancer was put in such a lazy placement. Oh, let's throw him in some cage near some barrels because we have to do something with that deck. The enemies are tedious, the area is horrible but required, the boss is horrible but pretty much required because a transposing kiln gives use to boss souls, and there's also dogs and rats. This comment goes on to list some of the nice things about the area, such as introductions to cool NPCs like Yol, Sigurd, and Arena, but that's about it. I can agree with most of the comment, particularly about the terrible boss, the lackluster to downright irritating enemies like dogs and rats, but one thing I will say is that despite this area being overly large and a bit dull, it does have good interconnected design. Upon full exploration, I was surprised at how well everything connects, so I'll give it that piece of credit, and for that I don't think it's particularly bad, especially on your first playthrough where you're hungry to explore. I think the problem comes in on subsequent playthroughs when you just want to be done with this area in a flash and there's no viable way to make that happen. For that reason, along with its troublesome enemies, I think Undead Settlement found its correct placement on this list. This is another area I kind of forgot had more to it. Every time I reach it, I grab the bonfire, run to Yorm, and never look back. And it looks like I'm not alone. I would say the Profane Capital is the worst in my opinion. It's a glorified pathway to Yorm the Giant, and after you kill him, there's nothing to do here other than leave. I can't even remember the last time I actually explored the remainder of the area, so I'll let one of you speak to it. It's awful. Don't let the nice open space where you find the bonfire fool you. It's the only good thing it's got. Apart from that, it's just a pair of tight corridors that lead you either to a toxic swamp with a collection of the ugliest enemies in game, or to a couple rooms full of enemies that drain your health on sight, and the fog that leads you to the most disappointing boss. I only explored this place fully once, never again. Sounds about right. I don't agree about Yorm being the most disappointing boss, but that's a topic for another time. Also, I'm not sure about enemies draining your health on sight being part of the Profane Capital, but I am certain about the Poison Swamp and a number of other trash enemies in that side section. So it's pick your poison, I suppose. Trounce through the area in 30 seconds and be done with it, leaving it as a disappointment, or slog through the rest of it and envelop yourself in toxic rage. Either way, they could have done so much more with an area that has great significance in the lore, but instead they left us with this disheartening mess. I think my favorite area is Cemetery of Ash. I like the gray and minimal aesthetic. It doesn't supposed to make you go, wow, it makes you go, damn. I agree, this area's drab palette is quite the tone setter and matches well with the name Cemetery of Ash. The majority of the rest of the game choosing to share the desaturated vibe is another topic. It really does make you go, damn, what's happened to the world, and piques your curiosity perfectly to open the game. The enemies are all appropriately basic, but you do have that Titanite lizard and the master to tango with if you want to test your might early on, which is great for those looking for a challenge. And speaking of challenge, I won't dwell on Edix's quality as a boss, but his placement is inherently important to the level design. The game requires you to defeat him to progress in the game. A roadblock this early is great, even if it will be passed easily by veterans. It makes the move toward Firelink that much more satisfying. The area may be basic otherwise, but it earns some well-deserved praise as a good teaser to set up the rest of the game. This is an area I was initially shocked to see not closer to the bottom, but when taking an overall look at the areas, this placement makes total sense. I have to remind myself often to not look at the areas as a means to an end to reach the bosses, and if you're willing to explore, the cathedral has a lot of worthwhile things to offer you with great branching design. It's an interesting place that takes you off what feels like a very linear path from area to area. It looks pretty good, the enemies are a fair mix of difficulty levels, and adds to the fantastic lore of Aldrich worshippers. Flipped-sided goes on to make an excellent point that this area is a teaching tool to show players non-obvious pathing like walking on rooftops and support beams, learning where to expect ambushes, and the giants teaching you that sometimes it may be best to treat an enemy as environmental and ignore killing it. There's also mention of some of the annoying aspects such as bleed worms, muck that you move slowly through when near the stomping giants, and I would expand to add that the crossbow and dog area is one giant fuck you to the player. The rest of the pathway into the cathedral isn't all that great either, but once you get in, I love how it's all structured. I particularly enjoy the adventure through the ceiling to get to patches in Rosaria. It's certainly an area with a lot to offer, but I think some parts are more satisfying than others. Not to mention the boss at the end if we are considering the destination to be part of the area's quality. For those reasons, I think the cathedral is placed nicely at number 13. Yet another placement that surprised me a bit, though again, all it takes is a step back to get a good idea of why. There's no way that the DREG heap is worse than areas like FARRON and Catacombs at CARTHUS, even if I do find the Angels to be one of the more absurd environmental hazards this series has ever produced. That's been a big theme in today's video. Rather than areas focusing on intricate level design that highlights clever ways to force the player into combat, we've got poison lakes galore, ballistas shooting you with little recourse for you to counter, and Angels annihilating you with magic if you don't stop for cover every few seconds. An argument can be made that the game would be repetitive and dull if the areas were designed without some unique level hazards, and while I think there could even be some truth to that, putting all your thoughtful enemy placements into the levels without major hazards leaves those with them sticking out like a sore thumb. On release, this whole ordeal was much worse. The Angels were nerfed shortly after the DLC launch because their damage originally was filthy, but even without it, they still pose a threat. It is lessened enough that the run for cover mechanic feels less dire, and searching the level for their weakness is relieving once you figure it out. I can show a few comments on the screen without reading them, but they essentially go over what I've already said. Stealth Souls doesn't really work, and it has a poison lake that makes it tedious. That said, the enemies in this area are mostly placed with care, and it's a wonderful homage to Dark Souls 2. And the Angel's placement with how the level allows for cover is pretty fair overall, with the exception of the poison lake. I'm trying to provide some fair counterpoints as best I can. While I do believe this area shouldn't be thrown to the bottom with the likes of the dungeon and Road of Sacrifices, I think its placement should have come after Smoldering Lake. It has redeeming qualities, but its downsides are too much to overlook from my personal point of view. For the final area on today's list, we have a retread of the Cemetery of Ash, if that's how you see it, that is. Let's take a look at two comments. Untended Graves is probably the worst for me because it's a darkened version of the Cemetery of Ash, which leads to Champion Gundyr, who is a pretty good boss because of how he can literally make a professional athlete jealous with that fucking charge. Other than that, the cool lore behind it and the champ and the eyes of the Firekeeper that can trigger the true ending, in my opinion anyway, the area has nothing else interesting because of how big a reskinned area it is. A lot of fair praise and criticisms as to why it should be the worst. Now let's take a look at comment number 2. Best area in the game for me is still Untended Graves. You come to this area where you've already been before, but everything is just dark. You know the place, but every enemy is harder, it is scarier, and you see the same boss you've already fought, but he is at the height of his prime, and in phase 2 he starts trying. Best boss in DS3, don't at me. You get to Firelink Shrine, and it is just absolutely devastating to see it without light and life, and you understand what Gundyr went through. Its atmosphere, enemies, and looks complements the lore surrounding it so well. A tale of two opinions. Both agree that Champion Gundyr is awesome, and they're goddamn damn right about that, but where they diverge is the area itself actually being worthwhile. Considering that it falls right on the average line, I would say that it's divisive, or at least that it's accepted to be pretty good. Personally, while I enjoy the lore and atmosphere thoroughly, I don't think they're enough to overcome it being effectively the same area retread from a gameplay perspective. The enemies being different in the darkened area does add some excitement and mystery, but not enough to compete with exploring a truly incredible area for the first time. It reminds me of finding the Hunter's Workshop in Bloodborne in the real world. It adds some intrigue to the lore, but from a gameplay perspective, it doesn't offer too much beyond what is already offered by the original. Even so, it deserves praise for emulating the feeling of facing Gundyr in the tutorial as a roadblock to progress by having champion appropriate endgame challenge that guards the truth. I'd say it perfectly represents the average area for Dark Souls 3, but I'm interested to hear what you think about the community's ranking. Do you agree with the worst and middling areas of Dark Souls 3? Were you expecting to see some areas here that didn't make the butt cut? Let me know in the comments below. We've still got the top 10 best areas in Dark Souls 3, so be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all the latest content. Check out some of my other boss lists for games such as Devil May Cry, Zelda, and Kingdom Hearts for more ranking goodness. As for this video, thank you so much for watching, and an extra thank you to those of you that voted and commented. Much love to you all, and I'll see you in the next video.